This is a video to look at the biological causes of schizophrenia. When we think about schizophrenia, think about as many different causes of schizophrenia as you can. Think back about crime to think about the different causes of crime. And we're going to be looking at some of the similar themes in schizophrenia. Here's a list to help you with some of the different explanations for schizophrenia. One explanation is that it could be genetically inherited. That's the first one that we're going to explore. You need to know this in some detail. Another biological factor is here, excess dopamine in the brain. This is another area that we're going to focus on. We could also look at another biological area, which would be the brain anatomy. And there is a theory to suggest that people who are schizophrenic have larger than normal brain ventricles. You can see that the other examples are psychological examples, such as family, cognitions, life events, and psychodynamic factors. So, the first bit that we're going to look at is the genetic explanation. The idea that schizophrenia runs in families, that there is some kind of genetic makeup or even perhaps a gene. So, is there a gene? How would we know? Well, there isn't a single gene. So what we would have to do is look at different ways of how we could research it. Think about the type of research that we could do to see if this caused the illness. I'm hoping that you're thinking about twin studies, family studies and adoption studies, exactly the same that we looked at in crime. You can watch this video clip, which is at the bottom of the PowerPoint. So, what are the main genetic explanations? Well, we have to look at how they're studied, and the way in which they are studied are these. Just mentioned twin studies, family studies and adoption studies. So how useful are we going to find this evidence, and what will we be able to conclude? So you will need to look in your sheets to find research to support the use of twin studies, the use of family studies and the use of adoption studies. You need to have a look and record the concordance rates for each of them, and then you need to make a conclusion as to what they suggest. Remember that if the concordance rate is 100% between identical twins, we should be looking for 100% in research if the explanation is totally genetic. So, what are the general figures for schizophrenia? Schizophrenia does tend to run in families. It's estimated that anybody in the population has about a 1% chance of developing schizophrenia. Most research that you'll look at suggests that if one monozygotic twin has schizophrenia, the other has between a 40 to 50% chance of developing the illness. One of the main researchers in this area is Cardno, and he found a concordance rate on different studies of between 48 and 51%. This is a piece of research that gives, from data compiled between 1920 and 1987, the main concordance rates for twins. So if we start by looking at monozygotic twins here, we can see that the concordance rate of monozygotic twins is found to be 48%. That's quite high. Dizygotic twins is 17%. So if you have a sibling with one schizophrenic parent, that's 17%. Siblings, 9%. And if you look at the top, going down to grandparents, nieces and nephews, it's much, much lower. So you can see at the top that the general risk of population is 1% there. So we're looking at the difference between first and second degree relatives. So what we can say from this information is that there is clearly a genetic component to schizophrenia. But again, it's only a risk. There is a 48% chance that if one twin has schizophrenia, the other one will also get schizophrenia. But as this isn't 100%, it does not rule out environmental or psychological factors, and therefore this is a limited explanation. The next explanation is the dopamine hypothesis. This is a biochemical explanation. You should remember looking at dopamine from crime and possibly from last year looking at OCD. So we can see here the pathway that dopamine works, and we can see here a synapse where dopamine is active in the synaptic cleft. So if you remember from previous lessons on crime, dopamine is largely responsible for our perception. Dopamine is the chemical that if we have too much of, it would make us start to hallucinate. So lots of researchers suggest that dopamine is clearly implicated in schizophrenia. So the dopamine hypothesis suggests that schizophrenia results from an excess of dopamine. This isn't because they've got too much dopamine, but they've got a lot of dopamine activity. And this is key for students who are looking towards getting A's and B's. There are 3 possible reasons for this. We don't know which is the correct one. So, it could be caused by the release of excess dopamine by neurons. So, the neurons could be faulty. It could be that the dopamine receptors are oversensitive, or it could be that you have too many dopamine receptors. We do not know. There is no evidence to say which of these is likely to be the most accurate. You need to be aware that there are 3 possible explanations. Make sure that you note these down. So, the dopamine hypothesis states that somebody who's schizophrenic generally has more dopamine active than someone who doesn't have schizophrenia. And as you can see here, we've got a lot more active dopamine in the synapse. Now, the most common of these explanations is the high number of D2 receptors. We don't know this fully. Research is continually being conducted. So this is a diagram just to show the normal level of dopamine in the brain. So this is what a normal level would look like. Now if we turn to have a look at the brain of someone who's suffering from schizophrenia, we can see that the dopamine level is elevated. There is more dopamine activity. So here we can see just a small amount of dopamine activity on a normal dopamine level brain. And here we can see a much greater level of dopamine activity. Again, it's clear from brain scans we can see that there is dopamine activity. We're not exactly sure why. This is one of the problems and why you need to refer back to the 3 points to state that we are unsure of which one of these. Research is ongoing in this area. So you can certainly see that there is a lot more dopamine activity in a schizophrenic patient from a non-schizophrenic patient. Again, here are some of the reasons. The neurons that use neurotransmitter dopamine fire too often and are transmitting too many messages. There's too much dopamine and therefore the patient starts to hallucinate. What we do know is that dopamine receptors are known to play a key role in attention and perception. Another way of studying people with schizophrenia for the dopamine hypothesis is to look at post-mortems. After death, the brain is studied, and it's found in lots of cases that people have too many dopamine receptors. This is a piece of research by Seidman in 1990. What would be good about conducting a post-mortem study? Well, you wouldn't have any issues of ethics, you wouldn't have any issues of consent. However, wouldn't there be a problem with causation? How would we know what caused what? How do we know that the dopamine has caused the schizophrenia? Did the dopamine exist before the schizophrenia? Have the drugs led to the increased dopamine? We don't know which way round. So one of the problems with a post-mortem study is we cannot infer causation. PET scans are another way to look at this. It was found in 1987 that there are more than twice as many dopamine receptors in schizophrenics compared to control groups. Again, clearly implicating the role of dopamine in schizophrenia. Vardy found that there is no difference in the number of dopamine receptors between schizophrenics and controls. What does this suggest? Well, it clearly suggests that dopamine plays a role, but it also suggests that there are vast individual differences. And that's something that we always have to take into consideration when looking at schizophrenia. Remember back from the first lesson, no two schizophrenics are the same. So, these are some of the evaluation points that you need to look into when you are looking at the biological explanation of schizophrenia. If you remember back to the first booklet that we did, there are lots of issues here. So first of all, one of the issues is that it uses experiments. Consider why this could be a problem. The dopamine hypothesis ignores genetics. Consider why that could be a problem. Consider why using twin studies could be a problem. It's a deterministic explanation. This could be seen as a problem as it ignores the role of free will. Adoption studies, we know that they're a problem because it's difficult to separate the effects of nature from nurture. If you go down this, you should be able to find lots of issues for you to be able to fully evaluate this approach. A few that I want to draw your attention to are ones like compares like with like. One of the main problems with looking at studies into genetics are that the way that concordance rates are calculated are different from study to study. And therefore, are we comparing like with like? Are we comparing the way concordance rates have been collected in one study to the way that they've been collected in another study? And therefore, it makes it difficult to draw conclusions. Sometimes it's been discussed the problem of the chicken and the egg. And it's quite similar with this in schizophrenia. What came first? Just think about this dilemma. So, did high dopamine come first, which then led to schizophrenia? Or did schizophrenia lead to high dopamine? We don't know. This is a dilemma that we need to consider, and it's something that there is no answer for, but you need to highlight this in your work to show that you understand that this is a grey area and something that is very difficult for us to deal with as psychologists. This ends the lesson on the biological approach. Please refer to your notes and your booklets to make further notes on this.